Uh, Welcome, everybody. Yes. I'd like to invite you to participate with us today in a conference on immigration, race, and culture at the borders of the world. I suspect that during the course of the day, there's a number of themes that we're going to explore. To be very brief about some of these themes, I'd like to mention the relationship between human rights and citizenship rights, the phenomenon of jingoism, the question of whether or not the world should have borderless countries. It would be timely and valuable to hold a conference on the themes of immigration, race, and culture. And it's especially timely because of the hordes of people of Middle Eastern descent who are about to reach our nation's southern border. And Jean's book essentially forms the centerpiece for today's conversation. We're also very fortunate to have the opportunity to feature a discussion of Jennifer Lee and Min Zhu's book that explores Asian immigrant communities and the model minority trope, a book titled The Asian American Achievement Paradox. And we're excited that Min Zhu is here with us today to guide us in an exploration of the subjects in her book. I became aware of her book when I was fortunate enough to be able to spend a year as a fellow at the Russell Sage Foundation, which is the entity that published the book. She is a professor of sociology and Asian American studies and a distinguished professor holding the title the Walter and Shirley Wong Endowed Chair in U.S. China Relations and Communications at UCLA. I'll also be remiss if I don't mention that another of our conference presenters, Niraj Kaushal, has a new book that is forthcoming called Blaming Immigrants, Nationalism and the Economics of Global Movement. And she's a professor of social policy at Columbia's School of Social Work. Now, there's some additional outstanding scholars who have been kind enough to join us here. First, I'd like to mention Clarence Lassane, who is a professor of international relations and chair of the political science department at Howard University. He is the one of the first scholars I've ever encountered who did an examination, an exploration of racial inequality in Europe. Um, he is a scholar of great international distinction, and his latest book is called Black History of the White House. Okay. I'd also like to introduce Mosi Ifatunji, who is a sociology professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has done an extensive amount of research on West Indian immigrants to the United States and the comparative nature of their experience with African Americans. But he's also in the process of developing a very interesting new project. So for a long time, I've said that the comparison between Black immigrants to the United States and Blacks who are native to the United States is an asymmetrical comparison. And what would be much more appropriate is to compare the experiences of African American expatriates to other parts of the world with Black immigrants to the United States. And that's exactly what Mosi is undertaking in his newest project. I also would like to make special mention of Adam Hollowell, who's a faculty member at Duke, who is in education and also at the Cook Center. And he is a highly creative and extraordinary ethicist who examines the relationship between social justice and questions of morality. So Adam is also going to be one of the contributors today. Unfortunately, Susheta Mazumdar is not able to join us after all because she suffered an injury, so she won't be able to be here. I also would like to mention an array of talented graduate students who will be serving as commentators in response to Jean Beaman's book. I'd like to start with Elijah Bobadilla, who is a PhD candidate in history, Ajane Clemens, who I want to claim as my student, and she's a PhD candidate in public policy, Erin Colston, who is a PhD candidate in history, and Amber Henley, an MA student in analytical political economy. Um, Also, we have a summer program at the Cook Center. which is known as the Hank and Billy Aaron Summer Institute for Young Scholars. And there are several of the students from the Aaron Institute who are here today, so I'd like to welcome them. And then I must extend a special thanks to Gwen Wright and Joanne O'Neill. Their dedication and efforts are organic to the success of any of the events that we hold of this type, and have been organic to the Cook Center's existence and development. Thank you. And I'd also want to give a special thanks to Alexandria Miller, our communications specialist, for the long hours that she's devoted to organizing and shaping this conference as well. And finally, I must make a set of acknowledgments, and the acknowledgments go out to Aidan Peters and the culinary staff at the Nasher Museum Cafe, Giorgio's Hospitality Group in Durham, Casey Wright, who is in the back of the room, and Case Love Productions for filming and recording this event, the Gothic Bookshop in Durham, and the Penn Pavilion staff. We are in the Penn Pavilion, so I want to thank their staff for all the support and help that they've given us. So to begin the conference, I would like to invite Jean Beaman to come to the stage to talk to us about Citizen Outsider.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I like call and response, it's my tradition. So I'm really pleased to be here to have this opportunity to present my work, and I'm really excited about today's events and the sort of fascinating conversations I'm sure we're gonna have, some of which that we already had last night at dinner. So I especially want to thank Sandy Darity for his very generous introduction and his lovely invitation to bring me here, as well as his continued mentorship and support throughout our relationship. For those of you who've read my book, I acknowledge him in my acknowledgments. I always read the book acknowledgments because I'm always interested in like social networks of academics. But anyway, maybe everyone's not like me. But if you read the acknowledgments, I thank Sandy, and I also talk about how he's a really great model for sort of supporting younger scholars of color. So I want to just thank you again for that. I also want to thank the staff and administration of the Cook Center, especially Gwen and Joanne and Alexandria for making all the arrangements to bring me here. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is, from my book, pictured here, Citizen Outsider, Children of North African Immigrants in France. So the central question of my work is sort of is understanding how citizens remain on the margins of mainstream society, whether it's France or otherwise, and what we can learn about how race and ethnicity operate in practice from this focus. So I want to start with a conversation that I had with Jamila, who's a 49-year-old of Algerian origin, who I met with in her office in the 8th arrondissement in Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris. So at one moment when I was speaking with her, she sighed and said, quote, "I think we see racism more and more these days in France. When I was younger, I remember some experiences. It all seemed normal. I didn't experience it as much as other people. I remember often hearing, quote, 'return to your country.' So people thought that, but my country, it is here. So how do you want me to return to my country?" I heard that, but today it is even more that she hears that. I had thought that as I grew older, that would change, that it would subside, that it would fade. We would no longer mark differences or distinguish between people. And I see that we do differentiate between people. We do it more and more, and I regret that. I find it sad. And so then I said, differences like what? And she replied, quote, "For example, there is discrimination. It is not necessary to pretend otherwise. There is discrimination. I mean, someone named Rahid Ben Mashan, it is difficult for him to find an internship. Or it is not only a question of a foreign-sounding name. because there is also territorial racism. If you live in 93, which is the administrative number for the Seine-Saint-Denis department, the banlieue is just north of Paris, for those of us not familiar with the geography. It's the same thing. You have difficulties. You could experience difficulties just because of where you live. So if we clearly see every day, there are small marks or indications. But I also believe it is because France has not always addressed certain problems in its past. It has not always acknowledged its past. So for Jamila, France belongs to everyone who lives here. She recognizes, however, that this is more theory than practice, as there are barriers to full societal inclusion for Maghreban or North African origin individuals, even those who are, quote, technically successful and, quote unquote, do everything right. So despite the racism that she witnesses in France, Jamila sees herself as just as French as any other French person. And I want to highlight that this is also sort of challenging narratives that people who are not, who are immigrant origin don't see themselves as French or want to be part of as French society. That's not the case. Okay, so Jamila grew up in the 20th arrondissement, where she continues to live with her partner. She has worked very hard to get to her executive level position as in a membership-based association. Yet her success does not shield her from the prejudices and mistreatment shown to her less economically successful North African origin counterparts. Jamila remains troubled by how other French people still see immigrant origin individuals as different or as foreigners. So in my book, I argue that the continued marginalization of individuals like Jamila reveals the continuing significance of race and ethnicity for shaping life chances and experiences in French society. So to consider how race structures French society, despite the absence of explicit state-sanctioned categories due to its Republican ideology, and I'm happy to explain that more in the Q&A, I basically argue that France is undergoing a racial project per omnivoyance formulation. So such a framework allows us to think about both the social construction of racial and ethnic categories, as well as the creation of a quote-unquote racial common sense, which signifies differences among individuals without these state-level categories. I also find David Theo Goldberg's work particularly useful for thinking about race and racism in France and Europe more generally, when he suggests that race is seen as a problem everywhere but Europe. This illustrates how race and ethnicity are taboo to discuss, yet as my research shows, remain omnipresent in the lives of individuals marked as non-white. And we can discuss how race and ethnicity are salient without relying on American-based conceptualizations of those terms. Okay, so in the French context, colonialism and similar structures have constructed a racial and ethnic hierarchy that mars the contemporary descendants of France's colonial empire, including through colonial rule in Algeria, in Tunisia, and in Morocco. So French republicanism as an ideology emphasizes the connections among citizens over any other characteristic or categorization. Race, as well as ethnicity, is not considered a legitimate category by the French state. It is not measured in the census, and recently the word race was actually removed from the Constitution. So talking about race, or even using the literal word race, is seen to exacerbate racism, and that's sort of like the everyday kind of thinking. So under such a model, acknowledging differences among individuals is seen as propagating those differences. And so, for example, the United States is often framed as a danger of what can happen when you do acknowledge these differences, to give a contrast. But despite the sort of Republican emphasis on the renunciation of such categorization, some scholars of French history, and I would argue also Frantz Fanon was really articulate about this, have argued that France has long relied on racial and ethnic boundaries in constructing its national identity, or how we understand France today. So because the French census does not ask about race or ethnicity, there is little data on the North African or Maghreban second generation. And just to clarify, I use those terms interchangeably. However, there are a few large-scale quantitative studies that have sort of combined data on where individuals were born as well as where their parents were born to show that roughly 26% of children born to immigrants in France are of Maghreban origin. More precisely, 14% are of Algerian origin, 9% are of Moroccan origin, and 4% are of Tunisian origin. This is according to a study in 1999, so this is a bit dated. But most research sort of on this Maghreban second generation focuses on the unequal treatment and discrimination and their disadvantage vis-a-vis whites, particularly in regards to sort of educational attainment levels and also labor market participation. So my own research is ethnographic, so I talk to people, including interviews with 45 middle-class children of North African or Maghreban immigrants living in the Paris metropolitan region, so both in Paris proper and in the surrounding banlieue communities. So I focus on the middle class who are educated, hold professional kinds of jobs, and are upwardly mobile compared to their immigrant parents. Yet, unlike their white counterparts, middle-class North African origin individuals do not experience the full advantages of occupying a middle-class status. The Maghreban second generation can achieve upward mobility through education, yet face a glass ceiling mobility to actually being seen as truly French by other French people. So most research on the second generation, both in Europe and the United States, focuses on the degree to which they are assimilated, acculturated, integrated, et cetera, particularly in thinking about specific outcomes. But Jamila can be seen as all of these, particularly in terms of her own educational attainment levels and achievement of a middle-class status, yet she's still alienated from mainstream French society because of her Maghreban origins. So I further argue that my respondents, like Jamila, and racial and ethnic minorities in France more generally, are denied cultural citizenship, which inhibits them from being seen as French as anyone else. Despite how they see themselves as being French as constitutive of their own identity. So even though they identify as French, they understand that others do not see them as French. So I frame the North African second generation as citizen outsiders, hence the book title, a term which Kathy Cohen uses to characterize the precarious social locations of Black American youth. She considers the degrees to which Black American youth can feel like full members of society as a way of understanding how marginalized individuals relate to the state, as well as complicating the relationship between race, ethnicity, citizenship, and belonging. So the middle class North African second generation is both inside and outside of the citizenry. They have made it, so to speak, but only to a point, as they are continually reminded that their citizenship and belonging is quote unquote suspect and questioned often by others. They are denied cultural citizenship from a young age, as I talk about in my book, which continues into adulthood in a variety of domains, including the workplace, higher education, Islam or the relationship with Islam, residential location, and the public sphere or in everyday life. They are suspect or seen as suspect at both micro and macro levels, from having their identity continually checked by the police, which I'll talk about later, in public spaces, to growing up with few representations of Maghreban origin individuals in popular culture or in government. So to give another example, Farid, who is a 29-year-old of Moroccan origin, who lives with his family in the western banlieue of Poissy, is denied cultural citizenship in relation to his employment and his identity as a Muslim. Even though he agrees with the tenets of Republican ideology of relegating religious practices to the private sphere, coworkers continually remind him of the strangeness of being Muslim, such as when he has to explain why he is not eating meat at work dinners because it is not halal. So he says, quote, "As soon as we make an effort, we find a wall in front of us. As for me, I had a lot of trouble finding my first job after I finished school. It took 1.5 years for me to find my first job. Well, my classmates, who were named Francois, Edouard, Frederic, it took them 6 months or 4 months to find a job. But for me, it took 1.5 years," end quote. So he feels that his experiences in the workplace are more difficult because of his North African origins. So up until recently, Farid had a successful career working at a bank. He was laid off due to the economic crisis. Yet he was quick to note to me that the bank only laid off Maghreban workers. White co-workers who started their jobs after him were not laid off. He remembers one of his coworkers suggesting he change his name to one that is more traditionally French, like Pierre or Jacques. He was encouraged to hide one marker of his difference, here his North African sounding name, in order to fit in. Quote, "They don't want me. They tell me to integrate. Me, I don't want to integrate. I am French. I don't need to integrate. I was born in France. I respect the laws of the Republic. But they still tell us, no, you are not French. You will never be French. They tell us that because our parents have foreign origins, and that automatically we do too. We are sometimes obligated to hide our differences as if we are ashamed of them. But I've arrived at an age when I tell myself it's my difference. I'm not looking to put it out front, but I don't want people to tell me to hide it." End quote. Hydration break. To give another example, I want to talk about Safia, who's a 33-year-old of Tunisian origin, who works as both a magazine journalist and editor, and lives in Cergy-Pontoise, which is a western banlieue, with her 2 young children and her husband, who was born to Algerian immigrant parents and works as a banker. So when she was describing her upbringing in Paris to me, she explained, quote, "I remember working really hard in school because I really wanted to escape my social background. I didn't want to be as poor as my parents or mistreated. Because when you don't know French perfectly well or have a certain level of education, especially when you're an immigrant, that's what happens. So I said to myself that when I grow up, it's out of the question to be treated like that. And I also worked hard because I wanted to earn a lot of money, to have my parents be proud of me. So there's a bit of social retaliation there," end quote. So here she recalls the discrimination and mistreatment her parents experienced because of their immigrant status, lack of educational attainment, and illiteracy. So Safia remembers learning that she was seen as different from others when she entered high school and a classmate told her she had quote-unquote matte skin. From that moment on, she understood that she would, quote, "never be completely considered as a French person," end quote. So this only intensified as she grew older. As a law student years later, she remembers classmates calling her a dirty Arab and telling her she should return to her country. However, she managed to be successful in her studies, earning both undergraduate and graduate degrees. There's much that makes her proud to be French, such as the sort of raw values exemplified in the motto of Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. But she hates that her identity as a French person is often still questioned by others. Quote, "Today when I'm with my children, people still ask me, 'What are your children's origins?' Or 'Where do you come from?' That drives me crazy because my children were born in France to French parents. And me, I was born here. My children were born here, and they still ask me that. It is so annoying to have to continually justify myself based on the color of my skin or the color of my children's skin." So Safia explains that her place in French society is challenged solely because of her Maghrebin origins. So one day in her office, one of the meetings we met in her office in the 15th arrondissement, she recounted a recent disturbing incident. So I will put this lovely picture up while I talk about the disturbing incident. So one day she traveled to Marseille, which is a town in the south of France, by train for some work-related meetings. She had no luggage with her, so she was not spending the night, and only had her work bag or a satchel with her. So when her train arrived at Paris's Gare de Lyon at the end of the day, she was stopped leaving the train by a plainclothes police officer. He demanded to see what was in her bag. She explained to me that he tutoyed her or addressed her using the informal tu form, the informal you form, versus the formal vous form. She was offended that he did not immediately identify himself as a police officer, nor use the formal vous or you form when addressing her. And that's seen as sort of a sign of disrespect when people do that. So he demanded to see her identification and asked her why she only had a work bag with her versus luggage. "Are you smuggling drugs?" the officer asked. "Are you a prostitute? Are you working for someone?" Humiliated, Safia explained that she was a journalist who went to Marseille for some meetings and showed both her personal identification and the identification indicating the publication for which she works. Quote, "The craziest thing," she explained to me as her eyes welled up with tears, was that the train was packed with people, with white people. There were a ton of white people, and I was the only one who was stopped, and no one said anything. The other passengers just stared at me," end quote. So she's currently thinking through how to address this incident, which, as she explained, she's seen happen to way too many racial and ethnic minorities in France. Quote, "You can't just let these scenes go by. How can people not think this is wrong?" And I always love this comic. So with this research, I really, as I talk about further in my book, I laid to rest this notion of a French exceptionalism, if you will, regarding distinctions based on race and ethnicity. So the examples of these citizen outsiders that I talk about also in my book reveal how non-white individuals do not get to be French in the sense of having their identity as French accepted by others. So though France promotes a sort of inclusionary community or inclusionary nationalism through the Republican model, it in fact excludes certain populations despite their citizenship, such as children of immigrants from former French colonies in the Maghreb. So ultimately, France has a growing group of citizens who, despite doing everything quote unquote right, can still never be seen as complete French citizens. They lack the cultural citizenship to actually be accepted as French. This illustrates, among other things, France's racial project, which creates a racial common sense and a seemingly or purportedly colorblind society. So by focusing on the middle class, I also demonstrate how being incorporated into French society or being accepted as French is not just a question of sort of, one's educational accomplishments or speaking the language or their professional status, etc. This minority population and minorities in France in general, I would argue, is unable to have their identity affirmed and acknowledged by others, and therefore will forever remain in a marginal social position or location. This also reveals how race and ethnicity operate as master categories, shaping, among other things, boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. So in other words, race matters because Maghreb origin individuals and other minorities are racialized. Race and ethnicity are not legitimated by the state because of Republican ideology, but nonetheless are evident through everyday practices of marginalization and exclusion. So because of this racial formation, non-white individuals will continually be left out of mainstream society, and non-white immigrant origin individuals can only achieve a quote-unquote partial assimilation. So even though Safiya and the other citizen outsiders I discuss exemplifies what immigrants and their descendants are supposed to do to quote-unquote fit in, i.e., work hard, be well educated, speak the language, hold middle-class jobs, what's clear here is that this will never be enough. She will still not be seen as belonging in France just because she's not white. So Safiya herself says that despite her own accomplishments, she feels that she is quote unquote French in the second degree. Despite her middle class status and educational and professional accomplishments, she nonetheless feels she occupies a France that continually reminds her of how her ethnic origins automatically exclude her from being accepted as anyone else. So I argue in my book that this is the reality for not just middle-class children of Maghreban immigrants in France, but rather all racial and ethnic minorities or non-white individuals in France today. Thank you. Questions? Yeah. Or comments? Yeah. Sorry, I don't know people's names. Please. Yeah, I think so. Oh, okay.
I think I have a comment and a question. My name is Maria. I'm a PhD student at Duke. So I lived in France for 3 years, and it was very clear that there was no way you could make it to a certain point. There was that glass ceiling if you are not white, Western European presenting. And so I think it's important to look at how the white French person perceives what it means to be French, because while they say there is laïcité or secular society. The reality is that it's based on a white Christian Western European identity. The foundations of French society are those. And so I don't think that there is any way an immigrant who doesn't present that way can go further up in society, unless maybe you're Japanese. I don't know. But the other thing is that there is a lot of tension, even just between the minorities. And this is not unique to France. And so I wonder, people of color are always trying to get the validation of their humanity from the dominant white society. So would it be more helpful if we were trying to acknowledge each other's humanity in terms of how we fight for our rights in these white-dominated countries? Because for sure in France and many other places, if their society is founded in white ideals, we will never be full citizens of those countries. Thanks.
Should we take a couple questions, or I can do either? Yeah, what's your question?
So this hopefully is sort of a short question. I'm Sarah, and I'm in the academic dean's office, but I'm a historian by training. And so one of the things I'm really curious about is sort of what has been the North African population, particularly, say, in Paris, but in France, for over the past 50 or 60 years. How much has that changed, not changed? Has there been any correlation between some of the attitudes towards the idea of, these people, these communities being able to achieve citizenship or not, and the degree of hostility towards that relative to population shifts? So that's my question.
Thank you very much, Jean. My name is Min Jo, and from UCLA. And I really like your book and your presentation. And also, I like your comments and questions, too. So I feel there is a lot of parallel between North Africans in France and Asian Americans in the United States in terms of that outsider status or forever foreigner status. And then Maria. So related to Maria's question about whether there is any political action to mobilize in the minority community for kind of making a political statement and making, fighting this struggle for inclusion. And I think in the United States, civil rights movement, and it's been successful to a greater extent, especially in terms of the recognition of who is an American. Like as an Asian American, very few people think of African Americans or black people as foreigner, even if you are foreigner. It's like the white people, but Asian people are still regarded as foreigner. So that is largely because of the civil rights movement and also because of the African American community, their struggle to have this inclusion in the American nation. Of course, African Americans are still sorely discriminated against. That's another thing. But in terms of this identity, this national identity, so I wonder if there is any parallel in France among Asian French, like thinking of them as forever foreigner, or they are too small to make their visibility. Thank you.
Why don't I answer these questions and then we'll go on another round so I don't forget. Yeah, so thank you for your questions and comments. I'll take the first and third together because they're sort of related. Yeah, I think I appreciate your comments and I completely agree. I think, yeah, laïcité is a big part of this discussion. I think what's interesting too to keep in mind is that even when we think about sort of France as a secular society, I think there's been some great work that's done. I'm thinking about Mayanti Fernando's book that really demonstrates that even that is used to that's configured in particular ways that benefit sort of Christian religions and churches versus versus mosque or other religion or Islam or other religions. So I think even when we think that that is a sort of universal standard of French society, there still is, for example, no school on Christmas and these sorts of things. So even that I think is more tenuous than I think is commonly understood. And yeah, I agree with your point about the sort of tensions between minority groups, particularly in light of sort of thinking about how different minority groups are also always trying to gain sort of recognition from a white majority society. I think that's what's interesting about that happening in France now is that I think that's part of the tension the second generation experiences. Like I think the first generation who were immigrants were much more sort of at least my respondents' parents were much more likely to think that there was a way to be fully included if one just did checked off the right boxes. And I think the population that I'm talking about is becoming more and more disillusioned with that fact, primarily because they have ticked off those boxes and they were born in France and they're still not accepted that way. So I think what we're going to see, at least in the next 20 to 50 years, is more of a rejection of some of this sort of need for validation from a white majority society. So I think you're absolutely right. And two, that parallels to Min's question, also thinking about sort of the role of political action in minority communities. So I'm currently doing research, which will eventually be my second book, on police violence in France and activism against that violence. And I think to your point about tensions between minority communities, there's absolutely tension between, some Maghreban communities that feel they've been targeted by the police and some sort of African origin communities that feel like they've been targeted by the police. And sometimes they can work together and sometimes they can't because I want to be really careful with my language here. There sometimes is a sort of disagreement as to who has it worse, to be kind of blunt about it, right? So I think you're right. So I'm seeing this right now of how some of these tensions are playing out. That like ideally you would want them to work together because they're all being sort of harmed by the police in different ways or hyper surveilled in their communities, et cetera, et cetera. And so to the role of the civil rights movement, yeah, that's a great. I hadn't thought about that. That's a great point. I think what's really interesting is. So thinking about the role of civil rights movement in creating recognition for Blacks as Americans, as compared to sort of perpetual foreigners or these sorts of things. So that's really interesting because there hasn't been a simultaneous movement in that way or social movement in that way in France. I mean, what was really interesting is when I first lived in Paris when I was a grad student, it was around the time that Barack Obama, his first campaign, eventual election, right? And so there was a lot of conversation, can France get its own version of Barack Obama? But then, how ridiculous would that be without the preceding, 200 plus years of struggle for Black liberation, right? And so I think that's kind of the tension. Like, they don't want to have a different model of identity politics. They want to just be seen as French, but then do you therefore not get your own Barack Obama? I mean, to be kind of blah, blah. So I think that's part of the tension with social movements in France around identities, because identity itself is not legitimated in the same way it is here in the States. And the question about parallels with Asian French, I don't know that much about that. I think they actually are a smaller community. I don't know of any mobilization. I think what's interesting is that there was a high-profile incident, and I'm blanking on the name, of someone who was Chinese origin who was killed by the police in Paris. I think it was last year, a couple years ago. And so what's interesting about that is how that case is sort of sometimes connected with other high-profile incidents of police violence, and then sometimes seen as very distinct, because it was like an elderly Chinese man. He was, there's a sort of different framing of the victim. And he was more, I think, seen as innocent than some of these other people, these other cases that I'm following. To the question of, the question of sort of immigrant flows and history. Yeah, thank you for that. So what I think, so I teach classes on race and ethnicity at Purdue. And one of the things I talk about when I talk about France is sort of keeping in mind that the U.S. has this sort of ethos of being a nation of immigrants and a very long history of international migration. France actually also does. It never imagines itself that way. So I always try to dispel the idea that immigration is a new thing that is happening in Western Europe. That is really not the case. And so part of what that means is, but what I want to say in corollary to that is that what happens is the raw numbers of immigrants can be very static, but it's sort of the demographic composition that changes, and therefore now it's a social problem. But the actual sort of raw numbers of migrants coming into France is relatively constant over at least the last 50 years or so. So a lot of this is sort of a difference between the actual numbers and the sort of discourse around those numbers. Yeah. So I think